If you followed true crime over the past several years, you may remember the Caneiro family murders. The case shocked New Jersey in 2018. A husband, a wife, two young children, an entire family wiped out in a crime prosecutors said was driven by greed. For more than 7 years, the case moved through the courts. Investigators gathered evidence. Prosecutors built their case. The victims' families waited for justice. Now, in May 2026, that wait is finally over. Paul Caneiro, the man accused of murdering his own brother, his sister-in-law, and his two young niece and nephew, has finally been sentenced. But before we get to what happened inside that courtroom, we need to go back to where this story began. Because to understand why the judge handed down 4 consecutive life sentences, you first have to understand what happened inside that house on November 20th, 2018. Before this became one of New Jersey's most disturbing murder cases. It looked like the American dream. Keith Caneiro was 50 years old. He lived in a beautiful home in Colts Neck, New Jersey, with his wife Jennifer and their 2 children. Jesse was 11 years old. Sophia was just 8. To neighbors, they looked like a close-knit family. Keith and his younger brother, Paul, had spent years building 2 successful businesses together. People who knew them described the brothers as inseparable. If Keith needed help, Paul was there. If Paul had something to celebrate, Keith was standing beside him. Their wives knew each other. Their children grew up together. Birthdays were celebrated together. Behind the family photographs, and behind the successful business they had built together, something had quietly begun to fall apart. No one could see it yet. Not Keith, not Jennifer, and certainly not 2 children, who still believed their uncle was someone they could trust. Every story has a turning point. Sometimes it begins with an argument, sometimes with a phone call. For the Caneiro family, it began with an email. Behind the success of the family business, something had been quietly falling apart. Money had been disappearing from company accounts. At first, the discrepancies were small. Then they became impossible to ignore. Keith Caneiro wanted an explanation. On the evening of November 19th, 2018, he sat down and wrote to his brother. The email wasn't filled with anger. It wasn't a threat. It was a straightforward request asking Paul to explain the missing money. Keith believed he was dealing with a business problem. He had no reason to think he was writing the last message his brother would ever receive from him. According to prosecutors, Paul was already under intense financial pressure. Investigators would later discover that Keith's life was insured for approximately $1.5 million. The prosecution argued that, after reading the email, Paul understood something had changed. Questions were coming. The missing money would have to be explained. Just after 2 o'clock the following morning, surveillance cameras recorded a vehicle leaving Paul's home. It was 2:08 a.m. The streets were quiet. Most families were asleep. Nearly 2 hours later, the same vehicle returned. A few hours after that, firefighters, police officers, and paramedics were all heading toward a quiet neighborhood in Colts Neck. Outside one home, Keith Caneiro lay on the front lawn. Inside the house, a fire was still burning. It would take investigators years, and a trial lasting several weeks, to reconstruct what happened during those 2 hours. The sequence of events inside the Caneiro home was reconstructed from forensic evidence, surveillance footage, witness testimony.
Were you able to come up with a determination as to cause of death of Sophia Caneiro?
And years of investigation. Just before dawn on November 20th, 2018, Keith Caneiro was outside his home. According to prosecutors, he was the first victim. He was shot multiple times on the front lawn. His body was discovered only a short distance from the house he had worked so hard to build for his family. Inside the home, Jennifer Caneiro was also killed. The violence did not stop there. Their son, Jesse, was 11 years old. Their daughter, Sophia, was 8. Neither child survived. Investigators later concluded that, after the killings, the house was deliberately set on fire in what prosecutors described as an attempt to destroy evidence and make the crime appear different from what it was. As firefighters battled the flames, crime scene investigators began documenting every detail they could preserve. The fire had damaged the house, but it had not erased the evidence. Years later, during sentencing, Judge Mark Lemieux reflected on the loss suffered by the Caneiro family. He spoke about the children and about the unimaginable violence they endured. His words filled the courtroom with silence. For Jennifer's relatives, No sentence could undo what had happened that morning. For investigators, the focus now shifted from the crime scene to identifying the person responsible. When the fire was finally under control, the investigation had only just begun. Detectives worked through the scene piece by piece. Every room, every vehicle, every item that survived the fire was examined. The first clues came from surveillance cameras. Video footage showed a vehicle leaving Paul's home shortly after 2 o'clock that morning. Later, the same vehicle returned. Investigators then began comparing that timeline with everything they had recovered from the crime scene. As search warrants were carried out, more evidence emerged. A gas can was recovered from Paul's property. Investigators also found clothing hidden in the basement. Forensic testing later identified Sophia's blood on those items. The investigation uncovered additional physical evidence that prosecutors argued connected Paul directly to the crimes. Taken one piece at a time, none of the evidence told the entire story, but together, investigators believed it formed a clear picture of what had happened. Paul Caneiro was arrested on November 20th, 2018. From the beginning, he denied any involvement. Years passed before the case finally reached a courtroom. During that time, prosecutors continued organizing thousands of pages of evidence. Forensic reports, photographs, financial records, and witness statements. In 2024, Paul rejected a plea offer. His case would go before it. The trial began in January 2026. For weeks, jurors listened as investigators.
I heard gunshots that were very concerning, and that's what woke me up.
Defense argued that prosecutors had failed to prove their case. Beyond a reasonable doubt, prosecutors disagreed. They pointed to the surveillance footage, the forensic evidence, the financial records, and the physical evidence recovered during the investigation. After hearing weeks of testimony, the jury began deliberating. It took approximately 4 hours to reach a unanimous decision. On February 13, 2026, Paul Caneiro was found guilty on all 15 counts. As each verdict was read aloud, he remained expressionless. For the families sitting in the courtroom, the verdict ended a legal battle that had lasted more than 7 years. It did not end their grief. By the time the courtroom emptied, the legal case against Paul Caneiro was over. The verdict had been delivered. The sentence had been handed down. There would be no parole, no second trial, no returning to the life that existed before November 20th, 2018. But long before the case became headlines, before the courtroom, before the evidence and the verdict, there was simply a family. Keith Caneiro was 50 years old. Jennifer was 45. Jesse was 11. Sophia was 8. They were making plans for Thanksgiving. Just 2 days later, their home would have been filled with family. Instead, those plans ended forever. The investigation lasted years. The trial lasted weeks. The sentence took only a few minutes to pronounce. For the people who loved Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia, the loss will last a lifetime. Cases like this are often remembered because of the person who committed them. But perhaps that's the wrong way to remember this story. Instead, remember Keith, a husband, a father, a brother. Remember Jennifer, a wife, a mother, a daughter. Remember Jesse, whose life ended at just 11 years old. And remember Sophia, 8 years old, a little girl whose future was taken from her far too soon. Their names deserve to be remembered far longer than the name of the man who took them away. Thank you for watching. If you appreciate carefully researched, true crime documentaries that focus on the facts and honor the victims, consider subscribing to The Anonymous. I'll see you in the next documentary.